In this video, Xbox is coming to your PS5, Sony knows why you love the PS5 so much, and your PS5 Slim is getting an upgrade. How's it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne and this is my channel PSReady that's all about PlayStation. So if you want to keep up to date on all the latest PS news with a little bit of insight thrown in for good measure, make sure you're subscribed and have your notifications set to all. I really want to hit 200,000 subs by the end of the year. The first thing I want to talk about is that it looks like Xbox is officially coming to the PlayStation 5. So there's three games right now that people are talking about as potential options to come to PS5. The first one is Hi-Fi Rush. The second is Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and the third one is Sea of Thieves. And honestly, I feel like all three of these games are smart for Microsoft to port to other platforms. Hi-Fi Rush is created by Tango Gameworks, the people who made the Evil Within games, and it's like a third-person rhythm action game. I thought it was pretty good. I played it back when it shadow dropped last year, but the fact that it's on Game Pass means that it probably sold through what it's going to sell through. And as we've seen specifically with one of Sony's biggest games, Horizon Forbidden West, once these games end up on a streaming service, whether it's PS Plus Extra or Xbox Game Pass, it kind of just kills all the sales. Like, it completely nukes them. And yeah, that's probably what happened at the immediate launch of Hi-Fi Rush. You know, like, they launched it day one on Game Pass. So I feel like actual sales are pretty low, but Game Pass is not on the Nintendo Switch or the PS5. So porting that game over, it gives Microsoft an opportunity to put one of their highest critically acclaimed games from the past couple of years on another platform and get a return on investment, because porting games to other consoles is a lot cheaper than actually developing them from the ground up. Sea of Thieves is another great option, and honestly, I don't think this will ever happen on Sony's end because they don't have a reason to, but I think putting live service games on as many platforms as possible is just what you need to do in this day and age. There is an implosion or something coming for the live service genre. There's just too many of these games. I've talked about it kind of ad nauseum at this point, but with these games that become full-time jobs to play, where not only are you putting single-player story games, as they're called, on the side, you're also putting aside other live service games. There's just not enough time in the day and not enough people out there playing games to make more than a few of these viable. So taking one that is successful like Sea of Thieves and porting it over to PlayStation or the Nintendo Switch, that's just a really good idea because it's going to build the community up, especially now when that game seems to be in its plateau phase where it's not really losing players, but it's not really gaining them either. I'm sure Microsoft has great data from two specific games, Fallout 76 and The Elder Scrolls Online. Those are technically Microsoft games now, even though they didn't make them, and they are heavily supported on PlayStation 5. So Microsoft is probably sitting there looking at Bethesda's data and saying, well, you know, we could use some more players in Sea of Thieves buying expansions and microtransactions, and the best way to do that is to port it over to PlayStation and possibly the Nintendo Switch. I'm focusing on PlayStation, but Hi-Fi Rush is also rated for Nintendo Switch in Australia, so I feel like at this developer direct next week, this is something that's definitely going to be announced. What is the third game? It's Sea of Thieves, Hi-Fi Rush. Oh, Ori Will of the Wisps, the sequel to Ori and the Blind Forest. I actually played Ori on the Nintendo Switch back when it launched there during the lockdowns. Ooh, that was a bad time. But I like the game a lot. It's a really good Metroidvania with some really fluid action and movement. And it's not really that kind of game that's brutally difficult. So bringing the sequel over, one of the only games released this generation that can be played up to 8K, I think that's another slam dunk win for Microsoft porting that over to PlayStation 5. The big problem that comes up from this is, like, if these games are up for grabs by PlayStation, what does that mean for something like Forza Motorsport or Starfield? Like, are those games going to be eventually ported over to PlayStation? We know that Xbox's strategy has really evolved past having an actual console, and Tom Warren deleted this tweet, but he was talking about how all the leaks about the next Xbox, the next gen one they're working on, basically say that it's going to have ARM architecture, which basically means it's a borderline PC. So Xbox is really getting to this point where they have a console you can buy and you're going to get a great experience out of it, but they want to make sure that everyone, as many people as possible, can play their games. So that means getting Game Pass with an Xbox. You can just download them in perpetuity and play them forever, or getting Game Pass on PC, buying them on Steam, buying them on the eShop, buying them physically for Switch, buying them for PS5. That's what's going to make them money and help them earn back the billions billions of dollars they spent on Activision and Bethesda. I mean, they're already a multi-platform publisher going forward anyway with games like Call of Duty, but I don't know. I kind of wish they just do their own exclusives and keep them exclusive. Like, I'm someone who's fortunate enough to have a PC, to have a PS5, to have a Series X, and I like having that delineation. Like, Xbox has a voice. They have a very specific kind of game that they, whether they bought the studios or actually made them themselves, sort of excel at, which is, you know, systems driven open world games. They've got some immersive sims in there. They've got some live services, but what they focus on is different than Sony in the sense that, like, they have the Gears series, which is like a Sony style narrative driven third person action game. But beyond that, there's really not that much going on the Xbox side of the fence in terms of games that play and look like Sony experiences. It is ultimately good, I would say, that PS5 players get to play these games because, of course, they don't have to go out and buy another console and they'll be able to play on their preferred system, which, you know, is an objective win for PS5 players. But, like, man, it's kind of sad to see the biggest competitor to Sony besides Nintendo sort of just giving up, right? Like, we have that quote from Phil Spencer that says they lost the most important generation, and I agree with that. But as we've seen with games like Forza Horizon 5, if Xbox puts out quality experiences that rival what you can get on PlayStation and actually are different than what we can get on PlayStation, people will show up and buy Xboxes. They might buy a Series S instead of an X because they just want that really entry-level type experience out of the console. But still, if you have a game worth experiencing, people will show up to play it. I fundamentally disagree with Phil Spencer on that point where he said having good games doesn't sell consoles. That's obviously not true, because right now it is true for the PS5 because there aren't really that many games coming out exclusively for the PS5, but people are still buying it. But the only reason that's the case is because they spent the back half of the PS3 generation and the entire PS4 generation putting out banger after banger, and that matters. That gets people in your fandom. That gets people excited to play on the PlayStation 5. So if Xbox actually started releasing these quarterly games they've been talking about for years now, and they were actually on par or even, I don't know, better than what we're experiencing on the PlayStation 5, I would have no problem playing more on my Series X, because all that's going to do is influence Sony and make them try a little harder to have games that either rival or beat what Xbox is beating them with. But it's going to be a very small ecosystem of gaming publishers compared to what we had before. And I guess I'm going to have to start looking to more indie games to get something different, like I do with movies. When I want to see a movie that's different, I go to A24, Blumhouse, or any of these studios that are smaller, pumping out $20 to $30 million movies instead of $100 million plus movies. And that's exactly what we're going to have to do with games. I also think that there is a future where Sony could be putting their games on Xbox. I think it's a lot farther out. Like, Xbox seems to be doing it out of desperation, but if it works, Sony's investors are going to say, hey, this is working for Xbox. Why don't you take a few of your live service games that have smaller audiences on the PS5 and PC and maybe port them over to Xbox? And a great candidate for something like that is the upcoming game Helldivers 2, which is really going to rely on having a big community. So if PlayStation gamers don't show up, all they have to do is port it over to Xbox, take a big chunk of money to throw it on Game Pass for them, and then the deal is done. And then in that eventual future, what we're going to do is just buy the console we're a fan of, knowing that we can play pretty much every game on everything. And at that point, I feel like PlayStation's got this in the bag, right? Like Nintendo, they sell a metric ton of Nintendo Switches. They've reached the mainstream. They've gotten so far out of the hardcore gamer that Sony has attracted during the PS4 generation. And I don't think Sony can really take that crown from them. But the Nintendo Switch is always going to be there. The Nintendo Switch 2 is always going to be there. The PS6 will be there as well. And then the Xbox Next will be. And I feel like at that point, people are going to look at buying a Nintendo console and look at buying a PlayStation console and say, maybe down the line, I can get a Series X if it runs their games that much dramatically better. The Developer Direct is next week. It's on January 18th. And we did learn that Indiana Jones is going to be there. It's going to be a 2024 release. And with something like that, or Blade, for example, I feel like those games are a perfect test case for Microsoft to say, if you want to play these games when they come out, play them on Xbox. If you want to play them 2 years later, like the PC gamers do on PlayStation, you're going to have to wait, and then you'll be able to play them where you want to play them. And honestly, if the games are good enough, I feel like a lot of people will be more interested in buying an Xbox to play them early, because that's exactly what I do. With a game like Horizon Forbidden West, you guys know I'm not super hot on the Horizon franchise. I had no problem waiting for the PC port that was announced at CES this week, but for something like The Last of Us Part Part 2 or the eventual Part 3, a new Uncharted, Ghost of Tsushima 2, even Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I'm playing that on PlayStation 5 because I know they're probably going to be really good games and I want to keep up and play them as they come out. It's just going to take a little bit of the hype away if I wait for PC. And yeah, maybe I'll get 60 FPS, but these experiences, like my want to play them, is big enough where I can take the hit and play them at the probable 30 FPS that they're going to be released in. This is just a rumor, of course, right now, but I'd say it's going to happen just because Hi-Fi Rush was rated in Australia for Switch and the PS5. And of course, Xbox has done this before. Minecraft is a weird outlier. They put Minecraft Dungeons on the Switch, which, like, yeah, that is weird, right? Like, it is weird to see that game go to everything, but that, like, you have to put Minecraft on everything. They also released Ori and the Will of the Wisps and the Blind Forest on the Nintendo Switch, and those didn't really need to go to that console. So they've done this before, so it's not really that big of a change, and that's why I could really see them doing this. The thing that would really get me nervous and interested, though, is if they port Starfield. I feel like once that game gets some patches, gets some DLC, gets some of the features people want, like vehicles where you can drive around these big barren maps, then that's the point where you put it on PlayStation and say, hey guys, it's in its best form, and that's where you could start turning the tide in terms of the general perception of the game. Because I don't know, I just got a feeling that, you know, PS5 players right now, they kind of hate on Starfield all the time, but if it did come to PS5, there would be at least a little bit of morbid curiosity there where people would play it. But what I don't think will ever happen is you'll see PlayStation Plus or Xbox Game Pass switch sides. Like, I don't think your Game Pass subscription will ever get you these games on the PS5, and I don't think your PS Plus subscription will ever get you their games on the Xbox Series X. And that's fine, right? Like, play on the console you want to play on, subscribe to the ecosystem you want to subscribe to, but then you have the option to play the competitors' games on your device in the future. Next up here, let's talk about CES real quick. I want to focus on hardware for this video. There was a new VR headset from them, a sort of AR thing to kind of compete with what Apple is doing in the new Meta Quest 3. That's not a PlayStation device. It's kind of like, to me, the Pulse Explorer versus the InZone Buds. Like, Sony makes both of them, but they're for different audiences, and that's cool, I guess. But what really got me interested is something they didn't announce. They have a booth and they have the PS5 Slim set up, and if you look at this picture, you'll see that it's the PS5 Slim with Deep Earth Collection plates on it. So you've got the red, the silver, and the blue, and that's interesting to me because it shows that Sony's just going to start converting over all the colored plates that they have for the original PS5 to the PS5 Slim, and I never really thought they would do that because the PS5 Slim has 4 plates, whereas the original PS5 has 2. I was holding that in, that whole story. Holy. Every time I've seen those cobalt blue plates, I've really wanted to pick a set up, but I wasn't going to swap them into my black PS5 upstairs. I think this also kind of spells the end of new plates for the original PS5, and honestly, I would expect an announcement from Sony pretty soon letting us know that the original plates are going to be phased out because the original PS5 itself is going to be phased out as they sell through their stock. They also have the PS Portal sitting next to these PS5s, and that is another thing where I really hope as time goes on, they start doing special editions of it, like maybe a black edition or a game specific edition. People really like the PS Portal to the point where I'm being sold on it, even though I really have no use case for it, because even if I wanted to stream my PS5 games to that thing, I could just do it on my Steam Deck OLED and it would look really damn good on that. But you know, people really love it. Colin from the Sacred Symbols podcast was saying it was a great experience playing with it over his Christmas break. So it might be something I have to give a try in the future, but I'm just being honest. The thing that would automatically push me over the edge is special edition versions of the PS Portal. I think that would be awesome, and it's got to be something Sony's working on, right? Like, that would be a no-brainer if you ask me. Next up here, we're going to go back to the current generation and talk about the PlayStation 5, because there was a new article that came out where a person at Sony who talks to developers about making their games work best on PlayStation 5 said something really smart and interesting that I thought was worth highlighting. So this interview is with Sean Benson, who's a person at Sony, and what her team does is they scout projects to make third-party deals. Now, this could result in something like Stray, which ended up being a second-party game. And if you don't know what first, second, or third-party means, basically first-party is if Naughty Dog makes a game, right? Like, Sony owns the studio, Sony completely funded the game, that's first-party. Second-party is if Sony hired Capcom to make a true exclusive for the PlayStation 5. Like they said, Capcom, come in and make Bloodborne 3 for us or something like that. We're going to fund the entire thing so that there's there's no chance it'll ever end up on Xbox. That would be second party. Third party is something like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Like, even though it's an exclusive, it's entirely funded by Square Enix over on the side, or a game like Call of Duty was before Xbox bought it. So what this team does is they go to developers who are making games for the PlayStation 5 and maybe even the Series X or Switch, and they say, hey, in the PlayStation 5, we have this controller, the DualSense, that has all these different features. It has a haptic feedback, it has the adaptive triggers, all these features that the other controllers don't have, and we would like to help you take advantage of those features. And a great example they give is Stray. I'm going to bring that game up like 100 times this video. They worked with the developers of Stray to give you that sensation feeling that you get in the DualSense that feels like a cat scratching on carpet. And I would argue that things like that go a really long way with the PS5 because of this problem we're seeing where for some reason games just don't run as well on the PS5 as they do the Series X. Things have definitely flipped. Like at the beginning of the generation, every game seemed to run better on the PS5 than the Series X, but as developers are figuring out how to take advantage of the Series X's extra headroom, games like Alan Wake 2, for example, run at a perfectly locked 60 on the Series X at a higher resolution, whereas on the PS5, it drops into the low 50s a lot. So a good way to counter that, outside of making better hardware, which they are doing with the PS5 Pro, which I guess is great, is using the DualSense and all of the features that the PS5 has. And a lot of people are responding positively to that, to the point where they're saying that the PS5, regardless of the lack of performance, is the best place to play these games. I feel like when you're using features that the DualSense already has, that's a better investment on the PlayStation 5 than overall graphical fidelity, right? Because when you're increasing the graphical fidelity, you're impacting performance. But when you're doing something like activating a feature on the DualSense, not only are you not affecting the game's performance, you're also giving people a reason to play on PlayStation over the Series X. And this is clearly a winner because Xbox has been putting out surveys for the past year asking if people want DualSense features in a new Series X controller, and we've seen that they're working on a new Series X controller to replace the one that comes with the Series X right now. So obviously they are seeing something at Sony where people are really responding well to features that the DualSense has that the competition doesn't. This is definitely something Sony has always been good at, you know, going to a bunch of different studios and finding a special diamond in the rough style game that they can put a little bit more money into to give it that extra edge over the competition. And all they ever really ask for is like a year of exclusivity, which in my opinion is pretty generous. Like, I would think it would be worth it for them to just spend even more money on these games and make them fully exclusive to the PlayStation 5 and maybe PC, because at that point, if the game is a huge hit, putting that extra money into it is going to make it even better, and then it'll be exclusive to the PlayStation and give people even more reasons to go pick up a PS5 over a Series X. But yeah, this was really a refreshing interview to read because we've heard all of this internal turmoil happening at Sony, like Jim Ryan leaving, huge names from the mobile division leaving, huge names leaving studios. Like, things are rough when it comes to people leaving big studios at PlayStation on top of all the layoffs we've had. So when you get a story like this where someone's just talking about their job, it doesn't feel super scripted or like PR speak or anything like that, and they're actually excited about it, it's good to hear that because it makes Sony as a whole, you know, the whole PlayStation brand, feel a lot less corporate, which is definitely where they're heading with things like silence all the time, never telling us what they're working on, and just being way too careful and critical with their marketing.